Hello, everyone. Uh, Welcome to Hashi Talks. And just like you, I'm also excited to be back at the Hashi Talks event. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is joining from around the globe to the Hashi Talks event. I'm going to present a topic around the zero trust security and identity management with HashiCorp Boundary tool. A bit about myself. I'm working as a senior cloud native architect with VMware. And my role here is to help customers help in their app modernization journey using VMware Tanzu Kubernetes platform. I have been a speaker in the Open Source Summit in the previous edition of HashiTalk, DevOps India Summit, and the Docker India group. I'm involved in multiple tech community meetups, and I do talk around DevOps, cloud native tools, Kubernetes, and serverless technology. So when I'm not talking or in my work, I do love traveling, and I'm a big foodie. So let us look into the agenda. So what we are going to see today is understand the traditional workflow for identity management, the challenges that is involved in this current workflow model, how Boundary as a tool aims to solve this challenge in this current access workflow, understanding the Boundary workflow a little deeper, and then a demo around the solution. So let us look into the traditional workflow. So as a user, like he can be a normal user or a developer who is trying to request an access to a private system in a system in a private network. Normally, he has to go through the following four steps. First, he has to request access to any gateway node that can be a VPN or can be a bastion host, where he has to provide some credentials in the form of the IP address of the VPN server, the SSH key to log into the bastion host, or maybe the authentication username and password. So once he logged in into the VPN server, he gets access to the private network. And however, since he's already access to a network, he also have access to other systems in the network, which is not desirable. So again, the system administrator has to create certain firewall policies, implementing that only the desired system should be accessible to the user. So so that's why a lot of firewall rules has to be defined. Also, whenever the application has to be given access to the system, one has to share the credentials as well to connect to that particular application. Now, in this traditional workflow, we see a lot of challenges that is involved. So first of all, this kind of model is very much good or relevant in case you have a very static environment where things don't change. But let's say if you're working in a much more dynamic environment where you are dealing with containers, Kubernetes, where pods or like Kubernetes based objects, pods which are like Kubernetes based objects are ephemeral in nature, right? So you don't have a fixed set of IP addresses to connect to. So this model doesn't work in that case. So few of the challenges that we have that has been seen while creating this kind of workflow is that onboarding becomes difficult, especially you're uh, when when you're scaling up your environment, right? Now, even though you give access to the user, since the user has access to the private network, he can connect to any of the systems which is available in the environment, which is not a desirable effect that we want, because it obviously is a security breach. So then you have to manage the set of static IPs separately in IP policies, which is again overhead in managing such a large scale environment. Also, one of the other factor is that you have to always share the credentials. Let's say, for example, developer wants to connect to a database. So for that, the database credentials has to be shared over this private network to the user, which is not a desirable effect. So the challenges that involves in the current model is that it provides a very wider privilege connecting to the systems in a private network. It is not suited in a cloud-based environment, which basically contains a very highly ephemeral systems that changes over some point of time. Also, sharing credentials is not a very good practice because there is always a chance of man in the middle attack if you are doing that, and it basically raises a security issue. Scaling the solution as workflow and infrastructure grows up traditionally becomes a pain point, and ultimately for the administrators to manage, right? And also, we can see that since you will be managing systems in a standalone manner, you have to create a lot of firewall policies, which actually doubles up your effort in managing the overall infrastructure. One of the most common problem that is associated with this kind of a model is that you, as a user, whenever you logs into a system and works for a certain period of time, during at a later point of time when the user leaves that particular organization, then what happens? You have to also remove the credentials from those systems where he has access to, or you have to basically, or if you're managing them traditionally in your own environment, you have to basically make sure like those credentials doesn't stay there because of, again, security threats. So you definitely wants to have it separate outside your environment, right? So how we overcome from this kind of a problem that is there in this traditional model? So boundary to the rescue, yes. So boundary is again an open source tool which is from the HashiCorp team, and basically the good thing or the beauty of the tool is that it actually helps to provide a zero trust security to your entire infrastructure using an identity management and a role-based access control, especially the credentials that you are managing for the end user, which becomes the first hop to your infrastructure, is not managed within the boundary environment. Rather, you can manage separately using any OIDC providers such as GitHub, or let's say using Okta or using Azure AD. So it doesn't actually reside in your environment. Then basically you apply certain policies and rules using the set of automations, and based on the policy or rule, you are basically allowed to access to that particular system. Also, during the whole process, whenever the request is made to connecting to the target system, and the request and the response that is coming, you can actually have the complete session visibility that is available to you. So that, let's say, if you assume that there is some area where you can see that some unauthenticated request has went through, you can take some actions on that. So let us see how boundary actually works in practice. So boundary basically has a feature called as a controller and as a worker. So basically, whenever any request that comes to the boundary controller, so again, any request that you are able to make as a user, let's say as a developer or as a end user, you can actually make through either using the graphical user interface, which is provided within the boundary, or via the CLI, or you can use an a REST API call as well. So the controller is responsible to manage the policies, that is responsible to ensure that you actually allow a specific you allow specific set of systems to be allowed into the infrastructure. You also, through the controller, you manage the set of or you manage the configurations, you manage the access rules that needs to be provided, and all these informations are stored inside in the database, which in case of boundary, it's a Postgres that stores the database information. Now one important thing here, that whenever any request that is created, automatically dynamic secret is generated, which is basically it's basically random in nature. And so this is being provided using the key management system. So using the key management system, so there are three different keys. One is a root key, which basically is responsible to provide you with the initial auth token to log in to the boundary environment, while there is another key, which is worker auth, which basically is responsible to authenticate with the worker for that particular boundary environment to proxy the connection. And the other is the recovery key. So recovery key is something where if you have for example, if you're forgetting your credentials or if you don't remember, then you can use that key to log in back to your boundary environment. So in this case, the boundary worker is responsible for taking the connection request that is coming via the controller and proxying it to the target system where you need to connect to. So to the end user, it will not matter how you are connecting. So because the entire communication path is being managed by the boundary worker, while the worker on the back end has a different way to connect to the target systems, whether you want to connect an SSH based, whether you want to connect simply say a Linux based server using SSH protocol, or let's say you're planning to connect a web server that runs on HTTP, or for instance, you want to connect a Kubernetes cluster also. You have the kubectl as the command line tool to connect to. So in the similar way, how you would have connect while logging into the environment is a similar way that you would worker would basically help you to do that. So one of the important factor to consider in Boundary is the scope management, which basically states that how you are going to set up your entire organization. So on a very top level, so Boundary works in a very hierarchical fashion, where you have the global level. Under global, you have something called as an organization. Organization is where you specify which users should be allowed to access to your environment, and what kind of rules they should be allowed. Like they would be given some actions. So actions can be, they can be an administrator, they can be a developer giving limited or read-only access to the users, and then they would be again part of a group. So group is again containing a set of users, so that you can imply the policies directly to the group instead of giving to the users. Now one down below, you have the projects, or we call as tenants, where you actually define that what is the host catalog that you want to target to. So host catalog is something where you basically define to group a similar set of host systems together. So let's say if you have a set of databases, you can create a host catalog with a database and basically create something called as a host set and define your host inside that. While you can have something called as a set of Linux servers, where you want to simply do SSH and or run some commands in there, so you can basically group them on the SSH group. So this way you can basically create some grouping, so that while connecting using Boundary, the Boundary knows that which specific target you need to connect to. Again, target is basically a logical context that actually points to the specific host set which contains the set of hosts together. So while using Boundary, you get two different mode to use. Okay, so one is the Boundary Dev environment, which basically is a standalone environment, which is mainly meant for non-production users, because it contains both the worker and the controller defined, and you cannot create a highly available environment or a highly available environment on it, because you would be running everything on a single instance, on a container. And basically the other way around is that if you want to basically create a very highly available environment, so you can configure the worker as well, the controller and the worker into different nodes, and then you can create a highly available environment around it. So Boundary Dev, when you run, so this basically initiates a single session that contains static defined username and password, which is admin and password, and it basically provides you with an auth token ID, which basically you use to log into that particular environment. While once you logged in, you are presented, or the session is there where you can live stream and get information, or you can basically see what are the events that is flowing through. So it's basically the terminal where you can get the live streaming of the event that is going through it. And secondly, we will once you have logged in into this specific dev environment, then you can basically use to target other credentials as well. So basically you can target any information. So let's say you want to read any information of the target, you can see that what are the parameters that is set to. That is also possible in the UI, which we will slowly see. So enough of talking and explaining. Now let's go into the practical side and see how Boundary works in reality. So let me open my terminal. Okay, so I have already initiated my Boundary session here somewhere, as I was showing. So basically you can see that whatever the informations is there, so you can basically get that this is an admin login name and this is a password, and specifically this is the auth ID that is creating to. So we can use this, and basically if you see, these are the stream of events that is going through here. So basically what we want to see that how the boundary terminal looks like. So whenever you install boundary, you get something, an UI, which I will show you here. So this is something, the boundary UI. So as I mentioned, on a top level, you define something called as a globe. Under that, you have something org. Under org, you define a set of users. So basically, you can define the users here, giving the specific set of permissions. And the group is basically where you can add a set of users together here. The roles is basically where you want to create a set of logical scoping, where you can define that what this user is supposed to do by granting some permission. So how we grant? So we grant using this policy rule, which we use here in this case. And then you can basically use this role to assign to a particular group, which ultimately gets assigned to the roles. Under auth method, you can see that what is the you can see what is the kind of authentications that you can get through. So here you get password based authentication or the OIDC based authentication that you can connect to here. So let's see how we basically use boundaries. So I already have created a few targets, which I'm going to show here. So yeah, so when you install boundary, you already get a static target, which is actually then SSH based, which you can connect to here. While I have also connected my local Kubernetes environment. So actually how you authenticate via the CLI. So you use the boundary authenticate command, and you provide the password with the auth method as given here. So this is a generator auth method, and the login name and password, and a token gets successfully stored into a system. You may choose not to store it as well. So in this case, for the you can actually store the credentials using Vault as well. So there is a provision that you can add a dynamic credential management tool to store these credentials as well. So now to basically connect to a particular environment, particular target, so you use the boundary target, boundary connect, SSH, and then the target ID you provide. So SSH, why? Because this is just my local machine where I'll be connecting to. So once I connect to it, asks for my user. So I'll just give my local system user here, and I'm connected to here. So once I go here in the, so once you get connected to, actually there's something called as sessions, which you can see gets already established in this case. So this is a very simplified way that you can understand that there is a session already being created here and you can manage it. Actually, Boundary comes up with something called as a Boundary Desktop App, which you can manage from your desktop itself instead of actually browsing through this UI. But I didn't do because it can do the similar actions that you are doing it here. So once you're connected to, so you can also have the provision that you can basically cancel out the session from here. So once you cancel out, automatically you get disconnected from your terminal as well. While at the same time, you can read the target that are provisioned to using the read command, which basically okay. I have given the wrong target ID. The target ID should be this one. So here you can basically see the complete target information regarding the connection limit that is set, how much seconds that is up to, and basically like the terminal will be terminal will be available till that particular time, till it times out automatically or gets logged out. And what is the scope generated for this particular target, and what is the authorized actions as an user that you can have on this particular target. Since I'm logged in by an admin, I can do almost all the actions that is permitted, and the default port that it is running to here. Now, this is fairly good enough in case we are basically running a very static configuration, but ideally, in a cloud-based environment, we want to do everything in a very automated way. So there comes my next scenario. So I'll just brief through what I'm trying to do it here. So in the second scenario, what I am trying to do here is that I want to create the exact replica of this scope that is defined together with the organization, users, groups, roles. The auth method, the project that I'm going to create the host catalog together with the host systems and the targets using Terraform. So Boundary, basically with Terraform, with Boundary, we have a boundary provider from Terraform that we can easily use to walk through the complete automation, or we can create the complete script defining these parameters within our script and generate them, so that this becomes very easy for us at later point of time whenever we need to change or update any fields as and required. So let's see how this happens. So I'll go back to my terminal again. So I'll just go, so I have the created the Terraform file. Just, so this is the provider boundary as I was talking about. So for this case, I'll just want to show what is the boundary version I'm running. So I'm just running the latest version, which is 0.7.4 in this case. 0.7.4. And here, so some of the providers may get, sorry, some of the type reference that I'm using within this particular provider may change with the latest version, or if you're changing, or if you're using an older version. So you have to basically refer to the actual provider documentation to get what is a type that you're going to use. So in this case, I'm just using my boundary server UI here, the auth method that I'll be using to log into the boundary, the login name and the password. What are the set of users that I'm going to create for my particular org that that I'll be defining, and then the set of default read-only users, which would be separate than the normal users, which I'll be creating. What is the backend server IP? So these are the IP which I am actually running in my cloud environment, and I have just provided the IP here. What is the scope that I'll be defining for this particular resource? So I can define the scope on top. Under the scope, you define something called as an org. So after that, you basically define the scope here, corp. So because under the global, we have one more scope that is already generated from the boundary. So I'm just trying to make differentiate here by creating another scope in this case. Else it would have created in the already created scope. Then what is the pass authenticate method that I'll be using for my corp? So here you have the option to use password or the OIDC as one of the option. I choose to use the password, but you can obviously use OIDC if you have any Active Directory, Okta, Dex, or even GitHub available to use that. You can use the set of users directly here. So you can basically provide what is the what is the user that you are going to create for that particular account. And also you want to so I want to create some read-only users, while I'm going to create some admin users. So accordingly I will give the permission here in this case. So if I go a little bit up here, yeah, so this is the organization read-only that I'm creating here. While there is another role that I'm creating, which is the org admin, and I'm providing the actions, which is create, read, update, delete. So this way you can specify that users have limited access to the system, that every user is not allowed to do all the actions within the system. And then you basically specify what are the target servers. So I have already specified, but then I want to create or map that logical context to the target. So in this case, I define something called as a host source ID, which basically helps to map the actual host informations to the target informations. And also in this case, you create something called as a host source ID, which basically helps to map the backend server IP details to the host server ID and details. So I know this is a bit longer, the Terraform file that we have to deal with, but yeah, I mean, when you're creating the everything from a scratch, things looks a little bit complex, but once you used to it, then probably you can just amend some part of it as required and then basically use it. So let me apply Terraform plan just to see what I intend to change is actually possible, or if there's any error it would show. So yeah, so I have 23 objects to add in this case. um, some of the argument is deprecated, but it's not that I cannot use. I can use it. Uh, Maybe deprecated from the next version. So in this case, I'll just do an apply. And yes, I definitely want to apply the changes. So it is creating the enter context from the manifest file into here. So 23 added, one change. Okay. Great. So let me come to the org, and okay, I can see my org is created under global scope here. And I have something called as a code underscore infra here. And if I go here, so I'll just go one back here. Under this particular project, I can see the users that I intended to create, the groups with 3 users that I wanted to create. They are created here. The roles that I want to define is basically the administration role with the grants. I'm sorry, the admin role with the grants that I want to define is create, read, update, and delete in this case. The read only, where I just want to grant read only access to this particular role. And then coming to the auth method, I just provided which particular method I'll be using. So I just using the password type as password with the corporate password here. So I just go inside this, and then I have the host catalog where I created a set of hosts that I want to target to. So these are the systems that are configured here in this case. If I go to the target, I will see there are 2 target created specifically for the SSH server and the backend server that is actually pointing individually to the to the host service that is configured for you here in this case. So this is the way how we can easily use Terraform in conjunction with Boundary to create a very secure environment that basically helps to provide secure identity management for the user to log into any system in a private environment, and also to an environment which scales up, or it's kind of dynamic in nature, right? So you don't have to basically use any of the restrictions that is there in the static environment to comply here. So coming to my slides then, so how Boundary addresses our existing problem. So if you see now, we can see that onboarding can become very easy as we actually can use a trusted identity provider that can be tied together with Boundary. And probably whenever the user gets offboarded from the organization, the user can then be removed from the identity provider as well. So there is no needed to access the Boundary data in this case. Secondly, the authorization is completely based on the logical set of roles and policies that we define, and accordingly the user get tied up to that particular system, and he gets only access to defining certain roles, certain actions on that. The user can select a set of applications from the host catalog. So even so basically this is the case that once a user gets logged into the private network, he will not have access to all the other systems in the network which is not part of this host catalog. Only the applications that are part of the host catalog the system will have access to. And fourth is basically the credentials are not tied to now. So there's a dynamic credentials that is provided to and given to the user for logging in. So these are some of the resources I use in preparing my talk, and thank you.